Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our weekly class in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. We are in middle of a paragraph of a Mishnah, chapter 2, Mishnah 5. Last week we did the first two lines, a first line and a half. Or in the English it's 3 lines. He used to say, who is this he? That was Hillel, the famous sage who focused a tremendous amount of his attention to the idea of love of your fellow, of the importance of living in a community and contributing to the community. But he was also interested in self-development. As I mentioned in past classes, Judaism is a lot about balance. Sometimes we focus on one trait, on one attitude, on one path, and some people feel that that means to exclude all the others. No, it's not true. Judaism wants us to do communal things, to be involved in a community, and to focus on the community, but it doesn't want us to neglect the individual, whether the individual is a fellow individual or whether it's yourself. There's a biblical verse that talks about how you have to help the poor, clothe the poor and the naked, and then it says, but don't hide from your own flesh. In other words, don't neglect yourself. There are people who only care about themselves and they do neglect their communal responsibilities. That's going to one extreme, and those who focus only about the community and not about the individual is the other extreme. And Judaism focuses on balance. Sometimes we have to go a little bit in one direction, a little bit more in one direction because of the needs of a particular period, and sometimes we have to go in the opposite direction depending on the needs of a community. So we already covered the first 2 points. I'll just go through them quickly. A brute, the Hebrew word here is bur, which we mentioned last week is the same as the English word for boor. A boor is a very empty person, a person who has no substance. So that kind of person is not sin-fearing. That person is not sensitive to sin. The word for sin here I mentioned last week is chet, which doesn't really translate as sin, but it translates as missing the mark, having some lack, a little bit of a lack in one's life. A person who's a boor doesn't have any sensitivity for accomplishing things, and therefore when things are not accomplished doesn't feel guilty about it, doesn't feel that he's lacking anything. There are people who can walk around and not care about anything of importance. Their life has no substance to it. That's the boor. But then there's the Am Ha'aretz, nor is an ignorant person, which is the translation of Am Ha'aretz, pious. Pious means to someone who's not just careful about doing what's right, but going beyond that which is right. A chassid is a biblical term that means someone who's looking to not just satisfy obligations, but to go beyond the obligations. And a person who's an Am Ha'aretz is an uncouth person, a person who's closer to the earth than he is to the heavens. You can put it that way. That person will not go deeper into Judaism and look for ways of going beyond the letter of the law, by being in touch with the spirit of the law, as some people might put it. So you have to be, an Am Ha'aretz is not looking for greater knowledge, satisfied with whatever limited knowledge they have. And the fact that people come to a class to learn Torah takes you out of the category of the boor and out of the category of the Am Ha'aretz. So you can all feel safe and secure here by coming. By not showing up, that's a different story. Then there are some questions about whether you're a boor or an Am Ha'aretz. But if you come to the class, this was a paid advertisement. But there are some people What is the hallmark of an Am Haaretz or a Bur? Someone who has no interest. There are people who have interest but have other impediments. That's the next one. V'lo ha-Bishan lamad, nor can a timid person learn. The Hebrew word Bishan is related to the word that means embarrassed. A person who's embarrassed to ask questions, a person who's embarrassed to do research because they're afraid that they might reveal their ignorance. If they are an Am Haaretz, if they are a Bur, and they don't want people to know how little they know, and therefore they don't ask questions, they don't inquire. So even though they want to learn, but they have a handicap that they can't learn. You know, it's interesting that in Hebrew, the word for embarrassed or shame is busha. Sometimes you'll hear Israeli politicians shouting at each other, busha, busha. And they probably are both right, because they attack each other. Politics gets very vicious in Israel. But the English word abashed is probably related to the Hebrew word busha. It's someone who's deterred from doing things because they're embarrassed. Now, you would think that that's a positive trait. And be embarrassed, to have modesty, is not a negative trait. For example, the Talmud says that what are the hallmarks of a Jewish person? How do you know someone has Jewish genes in them? That they have 3 traits. They could have other traits as well, but these three in particular. These 3 traits are that they are kind, they are compassionate, and they have modesty. They have modesty. That's one of the hallmarks, one of the signs of one's Jewish identity. If a person shows they have no modesty, if a person has no compassion and no kindness, then there's some questions about their Jewish identity. Because even if a Jew is estranged from Judaism, these are the traits that will still be part of their existence. And that we see this certainly in the recent times. There are so many Jews who have become alienated from Judaism, but nevertheless, they are at the forefront of different movements to try to help people, showing kindness and compassion, even if they're ignorant and even if they're not observant in other areas. It's not an excuse, but it just shows that that's something so deeply ingrained in the Jewish consciousness that even when they're estranged from Jewish practice and Jewish values, those are the things that they still retained. We get some more of that? Just a little an aside, there's in our daily prayers that we say 3 times every day, we start off with referring to God as the God of our fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. But when we conclude the blessing, we say, "Blessed are you, God, the shield of Abraham." We don't mention Isaac or Jacob. So there's a midrash that says that God says to Abraham, even though the Jewish people trace themselves back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they will conclude with you, with Abraham. And the simple meaning is that the blessing, even though we focus on all 3 in the beginning, but at the end, when we have to sum up what we're saying in this blessing, we only mention Abraham as if he's the dominant one. But there's another commentary given that it means, it deals with Jewish history. Abraham represents kindness. Isaac represents prayer, judgment, self-evaluation, self-refinement. And Jacob represents Torah. I'm not going to go into how that ties in with Jacob and how it ties in with Isaac. But Abraham associated with kindness. So although throughout Jewish history, Jews have always focused on the importance of Torah study, of prayer and of acts of kindness. But Jewish history, which we believe is coming to an end of the exile and the beginning of the Messianic era, how will the Jewish people conclude with Abraham? Which means that even if they're missing the mark when it comes to Torah knowledge, when it comes to other forms of observance such as prayer, unfortunately, and this is not a commentary that's positive, unfortunately, Jews have lost touch. When I say Jews, there are 15 or so million Jews. Of those 15 million, how many of those Jews study Torah regularly? How many of those Jews daven 3 times a day or even once a day? Unfortunately, it's probably a fraction. But nevertheless, the kindness that we inherited from Abraham, that has become an ingrained part of the Jewish personality. So no matter how far a Jew is alienated, those are the things that were retained. And one of those 3 things is kindness, compassion, and the third is modesty. So here it seems to be speaking against modesty, that the person who's modest and doesn't want to ask questions, doesn't want to make a fuss of themselves, that's a negative. That seems to be a contradictory attitude. But the truth is that it's not contradictory at all, because when a person, what is modesty? Modesty is where you don't make a fuss about yourself. A modest person doesn't talk about himself or herself, tries not to brag because they have no ego or a very small ego. That's what modesty is. And they try not to be ostentatious, not to show off. A person who sits in a classroom and has questions, but just using that as an example, it's not necessarily restricted to a classroom, and is afraid to ask the question because they're afraid that people might mock them because it shows their ignorance, or at least they think it shows their ignorance, which is nonsense, because the best questions are the questions asked by people who have very limited knowledge, because they ask the right questions. Sometimes people who know a lot ask questions because they think it's a nice thing just to ask questions for the sake of asking questions. But a person who really wants to learn, those questions are the real important questions. But if you're afraid to ask the questions, why? Because you don't want anyone to think that you're not so knowledgeable. Well, where does that come from? That comes from the ego. So it's actually the opposite. Sometimes shame could be an extension of your ego. I don't want people to know how little I know. You know, they tell the story of the rabbi who wouldn't give any speeches. So one of his congregants said, I want you to know that there's some people who are whispering that you're not so knowledgeable. So the rabbi said, would they swear, holding their hands on a Torah scroll, that I'm an ignoramus? No one would go that far. He says, well, if I start speaking, they're going to go that far. It'll be confirmed how ignorant I am. A person who asks questions and not afraid of exposing their lack of knowledge, that's a person who is just interested in learning, and the ego doesn't get in the way.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Aren't some people just shy? I mean, that's not a negative, right?
Not necessarily a negative, but it could be motivated by a fear of people thinking that you're not that knowledgeable. But sometimes it is, people are shy, yes, that's true. So they have to find ways of asking the question where they're not going to be exposing themselves and bearing themselves in a way that being shy doesn't want you to do. But if you don't ask the question, then you will never learn. And questions are extremely important in Judaism. You know the story of the kid who asked his father a question, and his father said, that's such an idiotic question. And the next time he asked the question, the father says, when you'll get older, you'll know. And the third time he asked his father, he says, why are you always asking questions? So the kid was intimidated. The kid says to his father, okay, Dad, I'm not going to ask you any more questions. Well, if you don't ask, you'll never learn. You have to keep on asking. And the teacher has no right to. Now, of course, if you're in a classroom setting and the teacher has to cover certain ground, and you're asking constant questions and you're disturbing the class, that you have to take into consideration. But you have to find other ways of asking the question when the teacher is no longer teaching the whole class. Not asking questions is a very serious breach of Jewish etiquette. Part of being Jewish is asking questions. And why not? I once got a crank phone call from some kind of anti-Semite, and the first thing I pick up the phone and said, "Are you Jewish?" So I didn't know, I had no idea who it was. So I said, "Wouldn't you think I'm Jewish?" And he says, "Tell me again, are you Jewish?" I said, "Couldn't you tell by me answering a question with a question that I'm Jewish?" And then he started, insulting and attacking, and I just hung up on him. But that's how you know a person is Jewish, when they answer a question with a question. And could you think of a better way of answering a question? Asking questions is so patently Jewish. As long as you're asking the question because you want to know. There are certain people who ask questions, they're just nudniks. You know what a nudnik is? You know the difference between a shlemiel, a shlemazel, and a nudnik? A shlemiel pours out the soup on the shlemazel, and the nudnik asks, was it vegetable soup or chicken soup? So a nudnik just asks questions for the sake of asking questions, or they like to hear their own voice, which is not because they're interested in learning. I remember once teaching a class of teenagers, and the kids, and the idea was to ask questions, and the kid would ask a question, and I started giving the answer, and he was talking to the other kid. He had totally zero interest in hearing the answer. It was a class where the kids were supposed to ask questions, so he asked questions. He did as he was told, but there was no interest in the answer. That's not a question. A question is where you're searching for knowledge. You want to learn, you want to know things better. And the more questions you ask, the more you understand the subject. The Baal Shem Tov once said that for every statement that anyone can make, he can ask a question. And for any answer that anyone could get, and any question that could be asked, he can give an answer. And for any answer, he can ask another question. And you can keep on going ad infinitum. There's no limit. Because Torah, especially with Torah, you can't necessarily apply that to every subject. Maybe you can, but with Torah for sure, because Torah is unlimited. It's unfathomable. It's so deep that no matter how deep you dig, you can keep on digging deeper and deeper and deeper. Some people stop at a certain point, but it doesn't mean that you can't go any deeper. One way of looking at questions is like walking up steps, a spiral staircase. So as you're walking up to the next level, you're hidden from the previous level. You're hidden from the next level. That's what a question is. A question is you're covering up. Something is not understood, but you're really getting higher and higher. So every time you have a question, you're going deeper and deeper, higher and higher into the subject. And the more questions you have and the more concealment, what is a question? A question essentially is, I don't understand. There was once a rabbi who was brilliant, and he had a lot of different commentaries, and he never wrote them down. He never published them. So someone asked him, why don't you publish? He said, I'm embarrassed, because what is a question? A question is a statement that says, I don't understand. I'm embarrassed to publicize to everyone that I didn't understand the text. But of course, that's an isolated example, because we're encouraged to publish our teachings of Torah, not to withhold them. Withholding Torah knowledge, the Talmud compares to a person who has grain in a time of famine and hoards the grain for himself and doesn't share it with others. Just like you could hoard grain and withhold it from others, you can withhold knowledge from others. A rabbi has no right to say, don't ask me questions because I'm not getting paid for answering those questions. He has an obligation to answer them. And if he doesn't know the answer, a rabbi should say, I don't know the answer.
Is it forbidden for a rabbi to withhold spiritual teachings? Is it forbidden in Torah?
That's the idea. That any knowledge that a person has, not just a rabbi, any knowledge that a person has, and someone wants to have them share it with them, they have an obligation to do it. Now, of course, it doesn't mean you can wake them up 3 a.m. every morning and say, Rabbi, I have a question. Someone tried that with Hillel. Remember, we discussed that. Someone had made a wager that he would get Hillel upset. So Friday afternoon, as Hillel was bathing, he knocks on the door and he asks him some ridiculous question. And Hillel very graciously answers the question. And he did this 3 times, and the guy lost the bet. So, of course, he shouldn't follow that example and disturb someone in the middle of the night repeatedly. He could do it once in a while, but not repeatedly. The Rabbi once commented about a rabbi. He told someone to call a certain rabbi who was able to help him. And the man said, but it's late at night. He says a rabbi has no excuse. He cannot be sleeping late at night. A rabbi has to be available 24/7. So, what?
6 days.
No, you can knock on the door on Shabbos. You can't call him, but you can. So ingrained is the idea of asking questions that we have 2 holidays that focus on questions. Everyone probably could guess one of the holidays. Passover. How do we usher in Passover? With the Seder, with the 4 questions. And not only that, but one of the questions is that why do we dip? All nights of the year we don't do dips, now we're dipping. What's the reason for the dipping? So commentaries have found reasons for it, but you know what the main reason is? The reason we dip is to do things differently so children will ask questions. In other words, you're supposed to do things in a way that will elicit the curiosity of the children, so they should ask questions. And sometimes you don't even have the answers, but you still want them to ask questions. And it's not embarrassing for a parent to tell the child, I don't have the answer, but let's look it up. Well, let's consult someone else who may know the answer. And even if nobody knows the answer, and there are such questions that nobody really has a good answer for, we go on and we say, well, maybe someday we'll find the answer.
Rabbi Gerfine, who we were on that talk with, introduced me to Freimer, who said, better a good question than a bad answer. He's a Jewish theologian and philosopher. Better a good question than a bad answer.
Right, there's an expression that teachers always use. There's no such thing as a bad question. Because even a ridiculous question shouldn't be put down when a child asks a ridiculous question, because for the child, innocently, that was a good question. And if you knock him down and say, what kind of stupid question is that? They won't ask anymore. So you really cut off their ability to learn. So you never tell a child, or for that matter an adult who has limited knowledge, you never tell them that's a ridiculous question. But it's interesting that in Jewish history there were questions that were asked and no one had an answer for hundreds of years, and all of a sudden 3 or 4 or 5 different authors who didn't have anything to do with each other came up with the same answer, which points to an idea that it's a different subject, but it points to the idea that certain times knowledge has its time when it comes into the world, into the consciousness of the world.
It's divinely inspired. That there's a teaching.
And at one point, when that knowledge was the right time for that knowledge to be revealed, then it becomes revealed. But if no one will ask the question, that knowledge will never be revealed. Someone has to ask the question, even if you don't have an immediate answer.
There are many examples of simultaneously in 2 or 3 different points.
Synchronicity.
Scientific innovations coming from different
right,
points.
It's called synchronicity, I think. Right, that's very common in Jewish scholarship, that you see rabbis who lived hundreds of years, hundreds of miles apart from each other, and they didn't have access to email or the internet. They couldn't communicate, and they come up with the exact same explanation. For hundreds of years, there was no explanation. All of a sudden, everyone has the same explanation. We find that very, very common. So it's the question that breaks through the barrier. You see, there are certain barriers. The Kabbalists will talk about how spirituality, divine energy, that God could shower it into the world and we don't get it. Why? Because there are obstacles, there are barriers. The barriers are either divinely constructed or they are constructed by virtue of our own negative behavior. So we create barriers. How do you break through those barriers? One of the ways of breaking through the barrier is through questions. A question is like a sledgehammer that breaks through the barrier. And if you don't ask the questions, because everything is fine, I'm not troubled by anything, those barriers remain erect. You have to keep on asking questions and inquiring. If you look in the Talmud, there are two Talmuds. There's the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is so different from the Babylonian. They were only written about 100 years apart. And it's the same rabbis are quoted in both. Not all. There are some that are only quoted in the Jerusalem that are never mentioned in the Babylonian, and vice versa. But the main rabbis are quoted in both, because the rabbis would travel from Israel to Babylonia and from Babylonia to Israel. It was very common. In fact, the Talmud tells about a certain great rabbi, Rabbi Zera. Rabbi Zera was a Babylonian rabbi, but he wanted to move to Israel to study the Jerusalem Talmud. But he was afraid that his knowledge of the Babylonian Talmud and the approach would get in the way of his absorbing the different approach of the Jerusalem Talmud. So he fasted 40 days praying to God that he should forget the Babylonian approach to Talmud. And he moved to Israel. He became one of the leading sages there. What's the major difference between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud? The Jerusalem Talmud will make a statement, maybe ask a question, give an answer, go on to the next subject. In the Babylonian Talmud, it'll make a statement, ask a question, give an answer, ask another question, refute the answer, bring up an argument. It'll go back and forth. The dialectics of the Babylonian Talmud are much more pronounced than the Jerusalem Talmud. So it's said that the Jerusalem Talmud, people were on a higher level. They didn't have questions. But yet when there's a dispute between the Babylonian and the Jerusalem Talmud, which one do we follow? The Babylonian. The Babylonian Talmud describes itself as we're in the darkness. Babylonia was literally in a valley, and in the valley you don't get that much sunlight. So when the prophet talks about how the Jewish people were sent into exile, Babylonian exile, it says, "B'machashakim hoshivani," he settled me in the dark. Babylonia was considered the dark. So the Babylonian Talmud says that refers to us. We're in the dark. We have questions.
These are the blessings of the diaspora.
That's the blessing, that you have questions, and because through the questions you're able to break through barriers and you're able to get to deeper levels of understanding. So on the surface it seems that this Jerusalem Talmud was superior because it was more abstract, more straightforward, less questions, but in the final analysis the Babylonian Talmud was deeper because of all the questions, because you were in the darkness. An example given is two people are in a room and they have to exit the room. They were never in that room before. They have to exit the room. One person who happens to be blind will start feeling the wall to find the exit. Then he finds an opening in the wall. Oh, this must be the exit. And it turns out it's a closet. So they keep on feeling around, and then they find a cupboard. And they realize it's not the exit until they finally grope, until they find the exit. You put a person who could see in the same room, what are they going to do? They're going to go straight to the exit. Who gets more appreciation for the room? The one who can see the exit and go straight to the exit, or the one who has to grope? The one who has to grope finds out everything about the room because they're touching every part of the room until they get out. So they go through a process of trial and error. And by doing that, they get much more knowledge than they would get if they were able to see without any obstacles in the way. Just go straight for the exit. Meanwhile, they don't know too much about the room. As I said before, that we have 2 holidays that are about questions. Passover is one, and the focus is not so much on the answers, because we have 4 questions, Manishtana. There's no direct answers to those 4 questions in the Seder. You have to infer the answers. Nowhere does it say, except for matzah and morar, those 2, there are answers given. But why we recline and why we dip, no answers are given. The focus is on the questions, because when you're young, that's what Passover is. Passover is a holiday of youth, because that's the birth of the Jewish people. When you're young, you focus on getting the child to be inquisitive. He doesn't have to know the answer to everything. Sometimes you have to tell a child, it's a good question, a great question. When you get older, you will know. You can't use that all the time. If you use that all the time, that's a cop-out. But sometimes that may be true. But encourage the child to ask more questions. But there's another holiday that focuses on questions, and that's Hanukkah. Hanukkah is also a children's holiday, but it's not only a children's holiday. But Hanukkah is a holiday that more questions have been asked about Hanukkah than about any other holiday, maybe about any other subject. I wrote a book, and I only published one part of it, of collecting 250 questions asked about Hanukkah. And the first volume has about 60 of those questions with answers. And there's one question about Hanukkah, putting that fact that there are hundreds of questions, there's one question that has been asked by someone about 800 years ago, 700 to 800 years ago, and then again asked by someone about 500 years ago, and literally hundreds of answers have been given to that question. The question is, I'll just tell you the question, it's not relevant to the subject, but if I'm mentioning it, you're going to be upset if you don't know what the question is. And the question is, why do we observe Hanukkah for 8 days? The miracle was only for 7 days. They had enough oil for the lighting of the menorah for 1 day. It lasted 8, so the balance is 7 days, so it should be a 7-day holiday, not an 8-day. There are literally hundreds of answers to that question, maybe thousands by now. There was one Hasidic rabbi, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, who I heard every night of Hanukkah would give another answer for decades. There were his own new answers that were never given before. So the focus on Hanukkah, what does Hanukkah where does it come from? It comes from the root chinuch, education. What does it tell you? That education requires asking questions. The Rabbi, I mentioned this several times before, the Rabbi once gave a talk, and next week, he criticized all of his followers. I said something last week, why did nobody question what I said? What I said contradicted some other source. How come nobody answered the question? No, I'm sorry, why didn't nobody ask the question? So everyone was very motivated to ask questions. So the next week, the Rebbe said, I got dozens and dozens of questions. Why didn't anyone bother to think of an answer? In other words, the Rebbe was saying, I'm not asking you to ask questions for the sake of asking questions. The reason I'm asking you to ask questions is because I want you to go deeper into the subject. So what happened then, as a result, dozens of publications started to be published with people questioning the Rebbe's teachings and giving answers. And the Rebbe would refer to these publications in his next talks. And the Rebbe was very happy that people were asking the questions. He wasn't always happy with their answers, but he liked the idea of asking questions, because that's the hallmark of Jewish education. So therefore it goes together with the next point, nor can an impatient person teach. We all know, I'm sure everyone here had teachers that fit into the impatient category. Teachers who didn't really enjoy teaching kids. One of my kids once asked, how come there's teachers who hate children? Why are they teaching? And unfortunately, there's a lot of truth to that. There are a lot of teachers who really don't want to be in the classroom. And unfortunately, they can damage the kids. But what's the proof that they don't really care for their children is if they don't allow questions. They're impatient with the questions.
May I offer an answer to the 8 days of celebration of Hanukkah? Eight is the covenant of humankind's, the certification of humankind's completing God's work. And so the miracle was God's 7, but we celebrate 8 because it was actually the human element that brought the miracle into creation.
The human element?
Judah Maccabee
So what does that have to do with 8?
Because without their efforts in searching, without their efforts in fighting, without their efforts in...
So you're saying in addition to the 7-day miracle, there was the miracle that the people fought for it.
That's because they...
That's one of the answers given, that the first day we celebrate the military victory, and the other 7 days is for the miracle of the oil. That's one of the many answers. But we'll get closer to Hanukkah, maybe we'll go through a lot of the other answers. I often wondered why there are so many attempts at giving answers to that question. And one of the reasons, I think, is that question, one of the answers to that question is that the number 8 represents going beyond boundaries. Because 7 is the cycle of nature, 7 days of the week. Shabbos is the pinnacle of the 7 days of the week. But sometimes we have to go beyond nature, because nature has built-in flaws. And the evidence of those flaws is the fact that the Jewish people are in exile, and there's anti-Semitism in the world, and there's illness, and there's hatred, and there's suffering and pain, all the hallmarks of exile existence. And 8 represents, it says Mashiach is associated with the number 8. King David's instrument had 7 strands, Mashiach's will have 8. What's the big deal of having one more strand? It's a qualitative difference. 7 represents nature, and nature is built in with flaws, with things that are missing. There's illness. The word for sick person, chole, adds up to 49. What is 49? 49 is 7 squared. 7 in its most perfect configuration. What is illness? Illness is when you're lacking the number 8. That means number 8 heals all the shortcomings. 7, and 7 times 7, is where there is the world of nature, which has built-in flaws. That's why when we ask God for all the things that we need in our Amidah prayer, the 8th blessing is the one where we ask God for healing, because healing comes from the number 8, or the number 50, which is 1 more than 7 times 7. That's why the Torah was given on the 50th day after counting 49 days, because Torah is the source of healing, the source of perfection.
50 is prophecy, correct?
50 has a lot of positive connotations, and the Jubilee year is 50. It's a year of freedom. We're free of all the constraints. So the question that people had about why is Hanukkah 7 days, we want it to be 8, is we're saying we want, the number 8 is elusive. We're looking for ways of introducing the 8 and what 8 represents. So that's why people are always asking questions. Is the symbol of concealment. And we're looking to get rid of that concealment to reach the number 8. So no matter how many answers we have, we still, as long as we're still in exile, as long as there's still pain and suffering, we're still looking for that number 8 and looking for reasons why it's 8 days. But whatever the answer is for that, I just use that as an example. It's one question, and it's preoccupying the minds of the greatest scholars for how many? 800 years. And it's interesting, the first person who asked it, his name was Menachem HaMeiri. Meiri comes from the word light. He was the first person to ask the question. What time is it? So the person who gets angry at his students is not a good teacher. Anger is not a positive trait in any case, but especially if it's a teacher. But then he goes on, nor will someone who engages too much in business become wise. What does that have to do with what we just said? We're talking about different degrees of interest in learning. There's the boor, who's at the bottom. There's the Am Haaretz, who's the next rung up. There's the one who's embarrassed to learn, embarrassed to ask questions. That's the next rung. He wants to learn, but he's embarrassed to learn. And then you have the guy who is not embarrassed, but his teacher is constantly shouting at him. That's another obstacle. And another obstacle is someone who really wants to learn, who devotes himself to learning, who asks questions, but he's so busy with his merchandise, with his business. His mind is in his business, and therefore he's preoccupied. He doesn't have the time to really focus on his learning. So he has the interest in learning, he has the right teachers, he has the right attitude of asking questions, but he's so busy in his business. Once a great chassid, a very spiritual man, went into the boots business, and he became so involved with manufacturing boots and selling them that he neglected his learning. So his Rebbe told him once, he said, strange, I always heard of people putting their feet in boots. I never saw a person putting his head in boots. That his whole life revolved around boots instead of around. So even though the person is steeped in learning and really wants to learn, but if you're steeped in your business, now it doesn't mean you should neglect your business, but it means that you have to find time. It says in the Torah you're not allowed to steal. The Talmud says for every vice the Torah talks about, there's a kosher version of it. Like if you want to eat pork, and you can't because it's not kosher, but you want to taste the taste of pork, the Talmud says you should eat a certain fish called shibuta. It has the taste of pork. And if you'll ask, how do the rabbis know? So the Talmud asked that question.
Is shibuta a real fish?
I don't know what kind of fish it is now, but it's that's the name of it.
That's the tasting you find out.
These rabbis had divine inspiration, or they heard it from someone who ate both. And but at any rate, what is the Talmud trying to say? The Talmud is trying to say that for everything that's non-kosher, there's a kosher parallel to it. God gave us both. So what's the kosher parallel to theft? You're not allowed to steal. What kind of theft is kosher? So I forgot which Rebbe said it, but the answer is to steal time from your mundane engagements to study Torah. Let's say you have to be at the office from 9 to 5 and you steal 10 minutes of the 9 to 5 to learn Torah. That kind of theft is kosher. The Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, when he came to his master, known as the Maggid of Mizrich, the Maggid of Mizrich had a son whose name was Avraham, who was a very spiritual person and a great Kabbalist. And the Alter Rebbe was known for his Talmudic genius. So they made up time that the Alter Rebbe would teach Rabbi Avraham Talmud, and Rabbi Avraham would teach the Alter Rebbe Kabbalah. And And the Alter Rebbe, they had a certain fixed amount of time. Let's say it's a half hour each. The Alter Rebbe would push the dials of the clock back so we can get more time. And he says those are the most precious times because it says, where does it say this? Mayim kenuvim yimtaku. Where is that? In Mishlei? Stolen waters are sweet. People could do the same thing that in a kosher way. It's not as sweet as when you steal. Stolen waters are sweet. So he said the time that he stole to learn more from his colleague, those were the sweetest times of learning. So that kind of theft is kosher. So a person who's engrossed in his business should sometimes engage in a little bit of theft, in the kosher form of theft. Okay, we'll leave the last sentence for next week, God willing.